All right. Yeah, so, I don't know. We could have picked a lot of songs to open the show today, but Joel Sobuel's evocation of the hazards of conventional hero worship seems kind of right on the mark here as we explore the monomyth and ways in which it maybe needs to be and has been transmuted, taken out of its very, very male-centric versions. So, I don't know. I've been telling stories this week. We have a lot of ground to cover. We don't have a lot of time. But let me just quickly tell this story. So I'm in college. It's like 1973. I'm in college. And part of my hero's journey is the idea I should go hitchhiking and have adventures. And it was in all the music at the time and everything, too. So I'm out hitchhiking, and it's actually pretty terrible. But I'm on Cape Cod, and I get picked up by three people my age who are from Westport, Connecticut. And we hit it off okay in the car, and they take me to where they're camping. They're camping out in the woods. I mean, they're camping on an unauthorized basis. The Cape wasn't as densely populated at the time. They'd found a place nobody was looking by a really nice freshwater pond. And so we wound up staying up late and talking and drinking wine. And we wound up talking, this is 1973, about Joseph Campbell. So that's how Bill Moyers and his Power of the Myth series, that was like 10 years away, I think. But even then, even in 1973, you could get picked up hitchhiking and wind up talking about Joseph Campbell. That is how powerful this particular scholar and his interpretation of myth and his evocation of the monomyth had become at this point. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to people who know way more about this stuff than I do and have obtained that knowledge from more legitimate sources than hitchhiking. Maria Tatar is professor of folklore and mythology at Harvard University. Her new book is kind of the reason for doing this episode. It's The Heroine with 1001 Faces. Obviously, a little bit of a play on Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. Jeff Garvin is an award-winning author of books, including The Symptoms of Being Human, and co-host of the Hero's Journey podcast. I'm pretty sure he's the one who doesn't do Schwarzenegger, but we'll find out in a minute or two. But Maria, I'm wondering if you could sort of get us going here for people who maybe missed all that Joseph Campbell, Bill Moyers stuff. What is it that we're talking about again? What is this monomyth?
Well, the monomyth, well, first, thank you for inviting me. And I loved hearing about your own adventure, your own journey, and into the woods. So it's really perfect. The monomyth. So Campbell is writing his book in 1949. Take yourself back there and remember that what is happening? Soldiers are coming back from World War II. So there's a reason, I think, for his glorification of the warrior hero, that type. Now, Campbell himself believed that this was a male-centric story, and that, when one of his students said, "But I want to be the hero," what was his response? You get to be the mother of the hero. You give birth to the hero. So what I'm trying to do with my book actually basically is to turn from the monomyth, and maybe we can talk about some of the steps in that journey to a kind of polymythical imagination, multiple possibilities for heroism.
Right. I'm going to quickly speed through the 12 steps. We can certainly play around with any one of them. It's ordinary world, the call to adventure, from that ordinary world to the call to adventure, a refusal of the call. I'm not going to do that. Meeting with the mentor. That's Obi-Wan, maybe crossing the threshold, test, allies and enemies, the approach, the ordeal, reward/rebirth, road back, resurrection, return with the elixir. I mean, other theorists, as you point out, had already explored this. Otto Rank, the disciple of Freud, talked about the baffling similarities in a lot of these sort of epic stories. But I think the other part of this, and maybe let's pull Jeff in here for a second, if what we're talking about, Jeff Garvin, starts to seem familiar to people based on their own television watching, movie going, novel reading, in particular, in the case of movie going, there's a particular reason for that, right? Because a number of people were influenced by Joseph Campbell, and we'll talk about George Lucas in just a second. But I think it might be interesting just to jump right in here right now and talk about the man who sort of spread this idea in a very determined way through Hollywood. So tell us about him.
Hey, Colin, thanks so much for having me on the show. And Maria, it's awesome to meet you. I've been reading your book, and just really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. So I think the man you're referencing is a man named Christopher Vogler,
Indeed,
who was working in the Disney story department in the late 80s, early 90s. And he read Campbell's book. He was so inspired by the hero's journey that he did his best. He distilled the ideas as he saw them into a short memo, which he distributed through the Disney story department. And it blew up at the Disney story department. And this was the golden age of, The Lion King, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin. And so that memo had ripples, and they just kept rippling out. It was a big rock dropped into a small stream. And he, facing pressure from his colleagues in the industry, turned that into a book, which he titled The Writer's Journey, which it sort of served two purposes. One, it was his way of revealing this mystery that he felt had been solved by Joseph Campbell, and sort of translating the 1949 ideas, which were, as I think Maria mentioned, very, very captured in that time of 1949. I mean, Joseph Campbell was a scholar and a brilliant man, but he was a man of his age, and the context of what he wrote in with Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, his ideas were very, very thick. To read that book was thick, and I think Vogler's idea was, let me make this easier to grasp for the average storyteller who's not a scholar. And so he wrote The Writer's Journey, and that influenced, generations of filmmakers, storytellers, film students, novelists, you name it.
Right. So, Maria, meanwhile, there's already a kind of umbilicus of influence. It's kind of sloshing back and forth between Joseph Campbell and George Lucas. In the case of the Bill Moyer special, part of it, I think, was shot at the Skywalker Ranch. So, Kat, this is A1. Let's hear a little bit of Joseph Campbell reflecting on Star Wars.
Does a movie like Star Wars fill some of that need for the spiritual adventure, for the hero?
Oh, it's perfect. It does the cycle perfectly. It's not simple morality play. It has to do with the powers of life and their inflection through the action of man.
But there's that word man again, Maria. There's a way in which, even though he's watching Star Wars, and even though Lucas is telling a pretty male story there at the beginning, although he's kind of introduced Leia, as a fellow Jedi sister to Luke. It's just sort of interesting how this is still a way for a man to understand his life rather than for people to understand their lives.
Well, yes, but I remember one of the things that Campbell said, which is just so profound, is that the secret source of all of our suffering is mortality. So what he's done is to capture a kind of pattern in which you have, and I'm going to reduce the 12 steps to 3. You have the call to adventure, and then you have an ordeal, which is always an encounter with death, sometimes a symbolic death, sometimes a real death and resurrection, and then a return with an elixir. And an elixir can take many different forms. It's sort of a reward, but often it's something that is beneficial for the social world, not just for the hero. It's something that will heal wounds and make the world a better place. So there's something truly universal about the structure. And you can find it if you watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians. They'll start talking about the journey that they're taking. And in fact, they go through a lot of ordeals and they do get a reward as well. So there's a wonderful way in which it is universal. And I think that the template helps us not so much to be creative and write new stories as to understand the stories that are out there.
Yeah, I just want to say, apropos of the Kardashians, that this book is terrific in the way that it starts at antiquity and just takes us through all kinds of different versions of these stories, from the Grimm's fairy tale versions of these stories to everything from Nancy Drew, which was a fascinating little sidebar there, and Elizabeth Salander. I hadn't really thought of her in this context. The Stieg Larsson novels. So it's really just sort of a wonderful piece of scholarship merged with a pretty canny look at popular culture. But then the question becomes. Well, actually, before we get to that question, let's go back over to Jeff. So there's a way in which, yes, the way that Maria just distilled this is really a perfect way to think about it. And when you think about it that way, one of the points that I know you've made on the podcast, one of the things that you've looked at on the podcast is, of all things, Hamilton. Let's hear just a little bit of A3, Kat.
In the eye of a hurricane, there is quiet for just a moment. A yellow sky. When I was 17, a hurricane destroyed my town. I didn't drown. I couldn't seem to die. I wrote my way out. Wrote everything down far as I could see. I wrote my way out. I looked up and the town had its eyes on me. They passed a plane around. Total strangers moved to kindness by my story. Raised enough for me to book passage on a ship that was New York bound. I wrote my way out of hell. I wrote my way to revolution. I was louder than the crack in the bell. I wrote Eliza love letters until she.
So, Jeff, a line like "I wrote my way out of hell" is sort of, could be ripped from the pages of Maria's book, too. That notion, well, what's the elixir? Maybe for Hamilton, it's his brain, it's his writing, it's his ability to take a bunch of gifts that weren't even really exploitable in his Caribbean homeland and do something amazing with them.
Yeah, I mean, that song is such a great recap for the audience of the show of the destruction that became Hamilton's call to adventure. When that hurricane tore through his town, disrupting his ordinary world and dragging him kicking and screaming almost, though he wanted to enter this adventure. And the town raised the money and sent him to New York to, as he says, in New York, you can be a new man. Hamilton is a hero who's incredibly complex, right? He is a deeply, deeply flawed, deeply brilliant man. And for him, I think the elixir is legacy. And he can't achieve that legacy until he gets forgiveness. And the forgiveness, of course, has to come from Eliza. And I want to see the Eliza version of this show, because talk about a hero. And, on the podcast, we look at a different book or film each month. And, the hero's journey gets cast as a formula or a framework so much. And it's hard not to think of it that way. But like Maria said, it becomes a way to understand stories. And to me, it's always a discovery process as I'm trying to analyze and find those elements as I'm watching a movie or reading a book. And I've also discovered that as a writer, that tool of those stages is completely unattainable. I can't get my hands on it during a first draft. I can only use it to go back and understand what I wrote or identify what's missing. And so I really encourage those who are interested in reading this book or Maria's or Vogler's book or listening to my podcast. It's really discovering flavors. Like if you read the bottle of a wine, the label on a bottle of wine, it tells you, hints of cocoa and shoe leather and red grapes, and then you taste it. You can feel all those flavors in your mouth. It's, to me, that's really what it's about, is enriching the experience that you're having inside a story.
And so there's so many places to go from there. But so, Maria, that kind of takes us back to the question of, okay, so how are stories told differently? And are they told differently based on whether their protagonists are men or women? And so one of the things that Jeff is suggesting, which I love the idea of, well, let's hear Eliza's version of Hamilton. I mean, that's a technique, right? I mean, Madeline Miller does it in Circe. Let's tell this story from the perspective of, or as you point out, there have been a number of attempts to elicit Penelope's perspective on the Odyssey a little bit more vividly. So that's one option, right? Let's see how this looks from the point of view of a woman who maybe isn't the protagonist in the original telling. Maybe you can comment on that a little bit. Yep. Do we have Maria? Maria, are you there?
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, great. I thought you were going to play the song first.
Oh, no, sorry.
Gosh, there's so many things going off in my head as you speak. Extraordinary. But, at the beginning of Hamilton, moved by my story, he tells us that his neighbors and friends were moved by his story. And then we go to the ending where the elixir, the healing potion, is telling your story. That is our salvation, that you will be remembered, that people will honor your memory and what you did. And then the extraordinary fact that you can take history, and our histories are all stories. They're collections. It's not just facts. It's not just dry facts, but someone has taken the events, turned them, spun them, woven them into a story. And then what you mentioned, that all-important question of perspective. We see things very differently when we think about, what Penelope experiences in the Odyssey. If we read Margaret Atwood's Penelopead, we get a completely different story. If I can go back to Hamilton for a second, isn't it Burr who is telling his story initially? And then we have Eliza coming in, and we discovered that she too has a story. And Jeff is exactly right. I can't wait to see the musical Eliza. I want that to happen sooner rather than later.
But, it does feel, Maria, as though when you do the perspective shift, the problem is, at least with the stories that come out of antiquity or even fairy tales, they're still rooted in a pretty patriarchal narrative. I mean, Miller's novel Circe is terrific, but it's about Circe growing up in a world dominated by men, in which decisions are made by men, in which women, usually by either subterfuge or outthinking them or noticing something that nobody else has noticed, you can maybe kind of find an opening. But you also might be punished very strongly for doing that. With Penelope, I mean, there's no way to tell the story of the weaving and the unweaving and all the things that she has to do to kind of get through this and have it be, I guess what I'm really saying, with men, it's often about military valor. If you shift the perspective to women, because of the way the first story was set up, it can't be that, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, myth and fairy tales, too, are all about action, deeds. And suddenly we have, a generation of writers, women writers, who are retelling the myths and the fables and the fairy tales, but with interiority. It's not about action and deeds. Suddenly we're inside the minds of characters in ways that we never were in the stories that were passed down to us. So we get inside the heads of these characters. We see things in a completely different way. And the events are processed in ways that really make us, rethink what happened, not just the thoughts of characters, but also the actions and deeds of the men who have been the dominant players.
So, I want to, Jeff, talk a little bit about, and we have to speed date through just a lot of stuff here, but how this manifests itself or how it begins to get told differently in modernity. And I want to ask you, because I know you've dealt with this in the podcast, because I listened to the episode, I would make the argument that if you combine Terminator 1 and 2, you have a pretty amazing hero's journey about a woman. That Sarah Connor, she's sort of everything. And at the beginning, she's like living in the ordinary world with her 80s hair, going to, clubs and stuff. And then she gets called into action. She has to do some mama bear stuff later on, but she also, on her own basis, in Terminator 2, we see her and she's all jacked, and she's smoking and she's badass. And there's, to me, that's like this really, to me, a very effective telling of a hero's narrative about a woman. Yeah, she gets a little crazy, but who doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah Connor is an incredible heroine. She's not just out to save her son, right? She overcomes that and she's out to save the world. And that's a profound task to take on. And of course, she's fighting these impossible machines, the superhuman machines. And it's, of course, a man who has invented these machines who look like men who are coming to kill her son. So, I mean, I'm so glad you brought up Terminator, because when Linda Hamilton did that role, she was determined that her character, that Sarah Connor, be strong and aggressive. And, women are often painted as crazy when they're the only ones speaking the truth. It happens in a more recent film, Don't Look Up. Jennifer Lawrence's character is really the one ringing the bell about this comment, and she becomes the laughingstock. When she's not crazy. She's reacting appropriately to an insane situation. But to talk about female heroes in modernity, I would bring it back to Margaret Atwood and talk about Of Fred, or as she's called in the show, The Handmaid's Tale, June. This is a different kind of heroine. Does she exhibit, traditionally masculine traits like Sarah Connor, strength, aggression, violence? Yes, but mostly she's subverting, she's manipulating, she's kind of like in jujitsu, she's taking the force and redirecting it to her advantage. And I think, we did the Handmaid's Tale a couple years ago on the podcast, incredibly challenging, because Of Fred does have a hero's journey, but it's not like anything you see in a traditionally masculine situation. The makers of Terminator 1 and 2 were primarily men. Margaret Atwood, and she's the creator of that show. And Elizabeth Moss, who's a producer on that show, has her own distinct experiences, and the way they form the arc of that hero's character, it goes through the cycle of the hero's journey. You can identify all the elements, but the actions that she takes as a heroine are very different than the kinds of actions a character like Sarah Connor would take. But I think it's great that modern storytelling has room for both. Right.
And so, Maria, we've got to go back to one thing that Jeff said about the Terminator movies and Sarah Connor. She's the only one who knows what's really happening, and nobody's listening. That's a very old archetype. I mean, we're back with Cassandra at minimum, right?
Cassandra, absolutely. And what an allegory of how women have been treated. Cassandra speaks the truth. No one believes her. She predicts the Trojan War. She has no credibility whatsoever. And by the way, she has a backstory, which is that Apollo courted her, and she rejected his advances. What does he do? He spits into her mouth and curses her with lack of credibility, of always having the gift of prophecy, but not being believed. So there's a story where we have only a fragment of the story, or at least, we all grow up learning about Cassandra, but very few of us know about how she was cursed with lack of credibility.
True.
And it is a story about how women have been silenced and continue to be silenced because words are their weapons. Words and stories have traditionally been their weapons. So if you shut that down, if you cut out their tongues, as happens in some myths, they lose the ability to tell the story. And in some cases, they have to resort to visual means, weave tapestries, and use other ways of getting the truth out, speaking truth to power.
Right. A lot of weaving going on. All right. So we have to take a break here. But yeah, Cassandra, actually Don Winslow, who's writing a modern 3-novel arc based on the Iliad, Odyssey, and Aeneid, actually has a character named Cassandra who sees everything coming. Nobody listens. I don't know. If I were writing a modern Cassandra, I think I might call her something like, I don't know, Cassidy Hutchinson. That sounds a little bit like Cassandra. All right. Let's take a little break here. We'll come back. Thanks to Jeff Garvin. Check out The Hero's Journey, the podcast, and the book, The Symptoms of Being Human.
With the strength to carry on, and you cast your fears aside, and you know you can survive. So when you feel like hope is gone, look inside you and be strong, and you'll finally see the truth.
We are back. We are talking still. We're talking still to Maria Tatar. Her book, The Heroine with 1001 Faces, is just a terrific journey from, as I say, this tales of antiquity to the most modern stuff you can imagine. It's all kind of there. Maria, in antiquity. Well, let's go to the Greco-Roman tradition for a second. There are these groups of women, but they're sort of like public utility companies. I mean, they just sort of do the same thing over and over again. I'm thinking the Fates, the Furies, the Muses, the Graces. They can't really have narrative stories, right? Because they're just sort of there to deliver one set of things. You really have to hunt a little bit more to find the women who have actual names and stories.
Oh, yes. And you've just pointed out that all of these figures of retribution, revenge are embodied as women, the Furies, the Erinyes. And also, by the same token, all our statues, our public statues of justice are what? Women. Mm-hmm. Women who are sometimes blindfolded, but not always, with scale in one hand and a sword in the other hand. Even as I mentioned earlier, women really had only words and stories as their weapons. They didn't have the sword.
Right. I mean, think of Scheherazade just telling stories to stay alive, basically. And so, yeah, in a way, the women also are, I mean, you can only have battles for so long, the Iliad notwithstanding. You can only be at war and then you got to put down your sword and do something else. And it's kind of women are often seen in the role of kind of either picking up the pieces or creating some kind of social mission that somehow or other transcends war. There's a way in which, and it's probably familiar to all of us, throughout our own lives, too. Women are expected to fix up all the stuff that gets broken in war.
Well, that's right. But they're also driven to do that on their own. You mentioned Scheherazade. She tells stories. She tells these cliffhangers to save her neck because Shahryar, the king, is going to execute her the following day. But she tells such great stories that he delays her execution. So she does that to save her own neck. But she also does it to save the lives of other women. And eventually, I mean, the beauty of that collection is at the end of the 1001 Nights, we learn that Shahryar has become a better ruler. He's stopped his bloodthirsty ways. So what Scheherazade has done is to change her culture through the practice of storytelling. Extraordinary.
Yeah. This book, by the way, you just have a wonderful eye for seeing similarities and themes and ones that a lot of people would miss. And we don't have time to go into your explanation of how Jurassic Park is at least partly a retelling of Hansel and Gretel, but it's terrific. People need to read the book to see some things like this. But one point that you make, which I think is important, and it might be what we have to end on because we're talking to Lev Grossman in the final segment, but you have a paragraph where you say, do we risk installing a disturbing new archetype of female heroism one that emulates the muscle and agility of classical male heroes. When we look at Hollywood's refashioning of fairy tales and fairy tale heroines in film, the slide from one extreme to the other becomes evident. And I think that's kind of all over the place. And I wonder my problem with Thelma and Louise a little bit was they just turned into the kind of jerky guys that they had been dealing with, kind of female equivalents of these kind of jerky, violent men. And as you watch this now, and people who follow comic book movies know that Captain Marvel is now a man, Hawkeye is now going to be Haley Steinfeld, and I sort of wonder about that, just turning the classic style of a somewhat violence-based hero into a woman. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, mimicking the male model. If we look back, we see that heroism is gendered, very strictly gendered, male and female. The great thing today, and this is what gives me hope, is that there are many different possibilities out there. So that women are sometimes warrior women. They have Game of Thrones and the whole spectrum we have there. Or Hunger Games, or Wonder Woman, Black Widow, Black Panther. I could go on and on. We have these tough women. But then we have someone like, Mildred Hayes in 3 Billboards, who is tough, but also shrewd. She uses the craft that women have relied on over the centuries. What does she do? She writes on billboards. She puts words onto billboards that draw attention to what happened to her daughter. So again, this idea, caring and using craft are such important features of the female heroine, but that those features can be adopted by men now too. That is, men. And I think we see this in films and in real life as well, where men are looking at, and not consciously, I think, but looking at the models of female heroism from the past and adopting them and discovering. Look at the way that, medals are now awarded, not because you destroyed a village, but because you saved other soldiers, or you saved others. So I think the culture is moving in the direction of that female model from times past, but still leaving open the possibility for many different forms of heroism.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, we have to close here, but the way that we read stories then turns into, at least partly, to the way that we kind of understand and process life, the way we decode life. We understand the things that we see in the real world, at least partly because of the stories that we've been told. So, thinking about all these, I made a little joke about Cassidy Hutchinson, but watching Liz Cheney these days, I'm thinking, whoa. There's a warrior, there's somebody who's not afraid, somebody who's willing to take it all the way to the end, kind of like the woman in 3 Billboards outside whatever that place is in Missouri. All right, we have to stop. Maria, it's been great. The book is The Heroine with 1001 Faces. The author is Maria Tatar. We've been very fortunate to have her. And it's Ebbing, Missouri, right? It just came to me. And we'll take a break. We'll come back. Our old friend Lev Grossman, the novelist, is going to talk to us about how all this stuff plays out in his work.
Support comes from the Hartford Gay and Lesbian Health Collective, empowering individuals of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities to lead healthy lives. Happy Pride. Visit hglhc.org. Be well. Be yourself.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog.
I'm Robin Young.
Before we begin this final segment, some special thanks go to Kat Pastor, as always, our technical producer, and then special service provided by the great one, Eugene Amatruda, also helping us out with the technology here, and Lily Tyson, who is the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, is the producer of this episode. And we are bringing back somebody that we talked to a lot many years ago, and I don't know how he fell out of touch. It's just the way those things happen. But he's a wonderful writer with a tremendous grasp of the kind of narrative, that kind of just ancient template that we've been talking about for the whole show today. Lev Grossman is joining us, an author best known for his Magicians trilogy. His newest book, which I don't know anything about, I'm embarrassed to say, is The Golden Swift. So, Lev, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Colin. It's good to be back.
So, maybe just begin with this idea that when you first decided to write the magician's books, I mean, it was just clear to anyone reading them that you were probably pretty steeped in this tradition, that you'd been reading it and loving it probably for most of your life. But could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, I'm assuming there are just things that you read, things that you soaked in that you thought, I want to try my own version of that. I want to see what I can bring to that.
Well, that's exactly what it felt like to me. The fantasy tradition, which we all know so well from The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Narnia and things like that. I mean, that really is where the hero's journey, it shows up everywhere, but that's where it lives in our culture. That's where those mythological stories really thrive right now. And they do thrive. They're so dominant and prevalent in our culture. And when I started to set out to write in that tradition, I put a lot of thought into this question: do I want to go along with this template which is handed to everybody, or do I try to find a new path? And the answer, I think, as it does for a lot of writers, turned out to be yes and yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would also assume that no matter how much you might have intentionally wanted to diverge from that path, there are ways in which, it's so well trod, and there's a reason it's universal, right? I mean, the notion of, for example, reluctance or the refusal of a call. I think it's very hard to write a story like this without some element of that.
The story of the hero's journey, it wants to be told. As you write a story, you can feel it pressing at you, saying, yes, you know how this goes. I'm going to give you the answer. You don't have to guess. This is what happens next. It's constantly, it's nipping at your heels, and you think to yourself, do I want to give in to this because it is so familiar, because it creates drama and feeling so powerfully and so readily, or should I resist it? Is this a voice, the voice of the patriarchy, or some other suspicious voice that I should be pushing back at? And sometimes sometimes you don't quite know.
Well, I think one thing it's been a while since I read the magician's books, but I remember them well enough to think, I think I was thinking at the time, well, Lev is he's kind of Scorseseing, or actually really almost sopranoing that fantasy hero's narrative tradition, in the sense that, in The Sopranos, it turns out those guys, they've watched all the movies, and they know what on screen mafia people are supposed to be like, and their own self-images are constantly being held up against those things. Your characters, because they are modern people and they don't kind of exist in the sort of Harry Potter kind of vacuum, they're very conscious of what kind of tradition they're in. I mean, that's one of the ways in which I think you did begin to break some new ground. What if these people already know these kinds of stories, right?
Well, it's a fascinating question, because, of course, we all know these stories. And so, on the one hand, we feel as though this is the way our life story is developing, because this is who we are. We are the hero of our own lives, and we go out in the world, and this is the fate that has befallen us. And then at the same time, you realize, wait, we've been given this script and told it many times, and we're just a puppet acting out the story that has been drummed into us. It's a very funny question. It always bothered me that Harry Potter had pretended that he had never read Narnia. Of course he's read Narnia. What else would he be doing in that little room under the stairs for 11 years? And I wanted to play with that in The Magicians, because the characters there are self-aware in the way that real people now are self-aware. And sometimes, just to be idiots, they'll go the other way because they'll do the thing that they weren't told how to do. And other times, when Harry gets confused or lost, someone tends to show up to tell him, to give him some good advice. Usually it's Dumbledore or Hagrid or some other avuncular figure. But of course, Harry is unbelievably privileged in that way. He puts it on like he's an orphan, he's lost, he's been abused, he's had such a terrible time of it. And yet, at the same time, when he steps out his front door and goes to Diagon Alley, he's the most famous person in the world. Mm-hmm. So on one level, he's a hero. He's overcoming great adversity. On the other hand, he's obviously suffering from crippling narcissistic personality disorder, because everybody pays attention to him all the time. So this is funny disjunction. When I read The Magicians, and I think a lot of people do this, they played with correcting for reality. it has been my experience that it's very rare for somebody to show up at my elbow with good advice when I need it. So the characters and the magicians, they're very lost, and they wander around, they wander off the path all the time. Their lives are so chaotic and disorganized because that, however much I wanted my life to resemble a hero's journey, that was more my experience. And of course, art is beholden on the one hand to these great mythic structures, and on the other hand, it's beholden to the reality of lived experience. And when you're telling a story, you kind of have to chart that middle path.
Right. I just want to go back to Harry Potter for a second because I've had the same thought that you've had, that he's, first of all, incredibly independently wealthy, and he has these special powers and everybody knows who he is and he's very legendary, and yet he's supposedly this kind of put upon Charlie Brown-like figure in some other way. And the only thing that I can say to kind of excuse all of that is that J.K. Rowling had a much closer view of Prince Charles than you and I do. And, Prince Charles is sort of in that category. He's incredibly rich. He can kind of do whatever he wants to do. And he just seems miserable all the time. So maybe that's sort of a British thing. But yeah, your characters, I think, correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, but I think in a lot of the conventional classical narratives, it's kind of like the hero is allowed one fatal mistake. Like Achilles does a lot of dumb stuff, but, basically it's all kind of permitted. It all kind of exists within the context of his incredible puissance, but your characters get to make a lot of mistakes. And I think, once again, because they're kind of modern characters, they drink too much, they ingest other substances that are not good for them, they have sex with the right people, the wrong people, they don't have sex with people they want to have sex with. I mean, they're very recognizable to us. And I'm thinking maybe that's an area where, like Luke Skywalker doesn't screw up that way, really, that I can think of,
It's true. And, he enjoys lots of kinds of privilege that many people don't. And at the same time, I have to admit that there are so many reasons why this hero's journey story endures. And when you find yourself approaching the end of your novel and you are desperately hoping that you're going to write something that is satisfying, well, the hero's journey, it comes back to you. And it's difficult, unless you're Samuel Beckett writing Waiting for Godot, it's difficult to entirely transcend it and get past it and still deliver something that people recognize as satisfying, as recognized as closure. So, as much as many times as the hero's journey has been shot, there are deep reasons why it doesn't fall down.
Right. I think another thing that you do is, and you're not the first person to do it, and I mean, arguably Rowling does it with at least her trio of heroes, is you have a little bit more of an ensemble approach. So you have a whole bunch of different people with different even reactions to the proposed bargain of the hero's journey. Not everybody sees it the same way. And then there are people who think they ought to be heroes and they don't get called. I mean, so there's one of the things that you do by having a kind of larger cast is you have a bunch of different people who might run through that whole process with a whole different set of suppositions and results.
Well, something I long to do as a storyteller is somehow acknowledge the fact that although if one's narrative may be focused on a single person, but everybody feels that they are the hero of their own story. Everybody's living their own hero's journey. And even the villain is. Villains never think that they're the villains. They always think they're the heroes and they're overcoming enormous adversity. This oppressive fellow, Luke Skywalker, who was always shooting lasers at me or whatever. If only I could get past him, then, finally the hero would triumph. Everybody feels they're living that story. And the hero's journey, it's so hermetic in that only one person can be the hero. And it's not like the world, thank goodness, because everybody's living the hero's journey at the same time. And it's so important to try to let that multiplicity, get into what you're writing. Otherwise, it just becomes this meaningless power fantasy.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that is harder and harder to do, probably became harder and harder to do somewhere near the beginning of the 20th century when, in fact, kind of the triumph of the therapeutic, the kind of Freudian notion of self-examination became more and more important and began to eclipse certain kinds of belief systems, it's hard to write a hero who exists only within a belief system, who exists within a mythology that's already valorized him or her and identified his or her purpose and all that. Because we don't live that way anymore. We're always asking ourselves questions. When I was a pretty young boy, I bought my first 2 or 3 Spider-Man comics, and there was an episode, this is very early on, Steve Ditko was still drawing it, and where Spider-Man was wondering why in the world was he doing this. And he actually swung through the window of a psychiatrist's office and then kind of unobligingly, webbed him up, tied him up in his chair with webbing, and then demanded to know why he was doing this from the psychiatrist, which was, simultaneously a very funny scene, but a modern scene too. But to me, that's one of the differences between you writing now and somebody writing centuries ago, is that you can't really write a non-reflective, non-questioning hero anymore.
Yeah, thank goodness. That's that's progress. And there are other stories, so many stories that are about different kinds of power. I mean, the hero's journey is about amassing power. There's something deeply authoritarian about it. It's about going and getting the power and then coming home and then you've got it. There are other kinds of power. And then there are stories that end with disempowerment, probably more than the other kind. I feel like people are wonderfully resourceful in undercutting the hero's journey in literature right now. And we have to keep at it, even knowing that its phantom will always be with us.
Yeah. I wonder if another thing that changed it was, in fact, sort of the end of World War II and the notion when the atomic bomb was deployed that you can have too much power. You can have way too much power. And I think that gets us, pretty quickly into some of the more modern fantasy things, and for some of your characters too, they're asking, can I really wield this power effectively, or am I going to make a mistake because I have too much of it? And to me, I think that's also a pretty modern set of heroic questions.
Definitely. And of course, the American intervention in Vietnam, for example, we were so accustomed to this idea that we were the good ones, wielding power on behalf of the right. And we very sharply discovered that the world is much more complicated than that. And I think the hero's journey was probably never the same again.
So I guess sort of last question, and you alluded to this at the beginning, that there's something a little bit inherently corruptive about like the original Joseph Campbell hero's narrative, and Campbell himself famously didn't even think there was any woman's version of it and that kind of thing. But I feel as though you writing in a more modern voice, you cover a lot of bases. I mean, there are male protagonists and there are female, major characters and stuff like that. I mean, do you sort of feel as though you've begun to solve that problem so that Madeline Miller doesn't have to write a novel from the kind of unsung perspective of one of the magician's characters?
I wish I could say yes to that to that question. I mean, I don't. It's not going to be a writer like me who is a straight white guy who's middle class who's going to solve these problems. I guess what I will say is that a lot about writing The Magicians for me was about recovering from depression. It was recovering from a mental health problem where myself became deeply disorganized and lacking in any power of volition, and I had to go through this process of dragging myself together and putting myself back together, and finding a way to get out of bed and get out the door, finding that kind of power. And when I look at the hero's journey, when I think about it, I still recognize that very much, and in a way that was very healthy for me. I needed to find a way to become the hero of my own life and to feel as though I had some power to make changes in the world. For a long time, I didn't. And I found a way, and the hero's journey really helped me.
Right. Love the David Copperfield reference. You have kind of Steerforth type characters as well at times. I like them too. Lev Grossman, I'm so excited about The Golden Swift. I can't wait to get my mitts on it and read it. Lev Grossman, an author best known for his Magicians trilogy. Thanks so much for joining us and for helping us end this show. Yeah. So that's our show. Thanks for tuning in today.